fahren wir verloren, wohl die Sperrkulsunde nur, in die Heiden Nazis dir Zorn.
Hello, listener. Today I want to talk a little bit about a poem and a poet which you probably have never heard of, but you've probably heard one of his songs if you hang around religious nationalist circles at all, especially Catholic ones. You've probably all heard the Palästinalied, and I'll put a little bit of the soundtrack here and there, the original version and the modern version that most of you will have heard. But you probably haven't heard of who composed it or what it was about. The author is Walther von der Vogelweide, a Minnesänger, which was basically a bard or poet, and a knight. He's called von der Vogelweide because he was probably promoted to knight on the battlefield. It was customary to name field promotions of knights after locations or things that, or at the place they would be knighted for famous deeds they did. Otherwise, or otherwise they would be called after the region they're from. But Vogelweide is such a generic name that he was probably never a landed knight, just a military knight. He is associated with especially the area of Thuringen and Austria, and he was honored particularly in a certain period in the 1930s, where they built a grave to him in Würzburg, because he was, of course, considered a national figure. Now, this Palästinalied, I found it very interesting because if you listen to the versions you've got up on YouTube, which are sang in a sort of old German dialect, it's incredibly similar to Dutch. I've translated the lyrics from Old German to Dutch, and you can see similarities, especially if you were to speak it aloud and you would affect the pronunciation in a more Dutch fashion. You definitely notice that there was a much bigger similarity to Dutch in this time of Old German. This was, of course, the time of the Old Germanic dialects. Standardized languages didn't appear until about the 19th century, when education was centralized by the state, and Dutch and German flowed into each other a lot more, even on the border regions right now, where in Germany, in the north of Germany, in the Rhine area and on towards Hamburg, they speak Plattdeutsch, and which is very similar to the dialects of Groningen and even Twente and so on. In the border regions, even today, the older people speak dialects on both sides of the border that are very similar and have nothing really to do with the standardized languages. The standardized languages in both Germany and the Netherlands are the ones who were popular spoken in the capital regions. So in Germany, they speak the more northern Hochdeutsch dialect, and here in the Netherlands, we speak the more popular Hollandisch, ABN, Algemeen Beschouwd Nederlands. Same thing in France, for example. The Parisian dialect became the standard in the 19th century and so on. Anyway, Walther von der Vogelweide, there's very little known about him. But he was, of course, very Christian. He did a lot with courtly poetry. Courtly poetry is... when I lived in Portugal, it was very interesting. We learned literature on that by the hand of... what was the first written literature, of course, at the time. There was courtly love poetry, and noble lineage books. So you'd have books tracing the lineage of various families, which of course was very important in a legal sense, because if you could trace your family through certain lines, you could have claims to lands and so on. So there was a lot of forgery there as well, a lot of lacunes in the how do you call that, holes in the, but you know, they would make the holes up with fictional characters. Like people would always claim to descend from like Hercules or whatever, or famous regional heroes. One in Portugal, they'd claim to like descend from Roman nobles, for example, or from heroic figures like Viriato, who fought against the Romans, these sorts of things. But this was the early written literature in Europe, was the courtly poetry. Poetry has always been older than standard regular prose writing, because it's easier to memorize. If you look at all the old sagas from northern Germany and so on, and the Nordic countries, it's all in verse, because this would be declaimed and it has to be memorized because there was no writing. We know, of course, that the Norse had writing. They had the runes, but they didn't write very much with it. You have some rune stones, but the runes were also more mystical at anything than a practical language. So half the time they don't even like form sentences. They're just symbols. So with the sagas, this was all oral tradition, and most poetry is oral tradition. It was a new thing to write it down, and this started around the period of Walther von der Vogelweide. He lived somewhere in the early 13th, late 12th century. We don't know if he himself was a crusader. He might have been. We definitely know he was a knight and a warrior. But his poem is basically praising, this famous poem of his is basically praising the Crusades. There's a little known verse that doesn't appear in the song, which I'll put up, and I won't claim it, because if I say it, that's a bit iffy. Another thing I'd like to note about Crusades in general is, of course, that not only is this language thing interesting, it's also, there were quite a lot of Dutch, Flemish crusaders. The poem this Palästinalied is about the Fifth Crusade, and one of the main leaders in the Fifth Crusade was William I, the Count of Holland. It was mostly a German and Dutch crusade, mostly German, which is of course why there was a German song made about it. Although it's possible that von der Vogelweide wrote it because he was a crusader on the mission. We don't know that. But the other notable Dutch Flemish, he's certainly of Dutch ethnicity, was Godfrey of Bouillon, the leader of the First Crusade. So there's this interesting tie there. I've also, I remember this story I read once about an abbot who got into a fight with a local innkeep, because the abbots in Flanders, of course, they brew beers, and it was a tradition back then. And the abbot got into a fight with this local innkeep who bought beer of him, and he ended up killing the innkeep with a mace. Mace is a very popular weapon at the time in Flanders. So he had to go on crusade. He was removed from his order and he had to go on crusade. And apparently this was a sort of a thing that happened. You killed someone in the Low Countries at the time. You either were banished, executed, or you got the option to just go on crusade then. So maybe there was a lot of fighting or something, and that's why there were a lot of Dutch involved in this. Certainly for Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the main drives besides religion. I don't believe this whole narrative that Crusades are fought not just because of land or anything. Like the atheistic sort of leftist worldview says that these Crusades were all fought for, they were really just greedy. They just wanted lands. Now that definitely plays a part, right? The low character of many Crusaders probably was just that. They just wanted lands as well. But I'm definitely sure there were plenty of religious zealots. Like the liberal worldview can't accept that there are people who will do things for an immaterial spiritual belief. They want to see everything in the same material reasoning they do. Now, I'm pretty materialist myself, but I accept that there are very spiritual people, and people do things out of emotional and religious and so on, genuine motivations. Like jihadists, who blow themselves up. There's no material gain there. There's genuine belief that motivates that. So there's plenty of crusaders probably that. And what I've read of Godfrey of Bouillon, I think he was quite a religious type. You don't slaughter entire cities just because you want to conquer the city out of a material perspective. It makes more sense to conquer the city and have the population work for you and produce wealth for you. You don't kill the unfaithful because you want to exploit them, because you want wealth. You do that because you have genuine zealous motivations. And that gets me to like the whole idea of crusades and religious wars in general. I've had this discussion lately with a few friends, online, offline, about what's more important, racial and material motivations or spiritual and ideological motivations. And I think it's kind of like a combination of the two. Like your tribal group, your racial group is important, of course, but there's also, that's like 3 layers below. That's like the very primal tribal level. And since we've developed we're no longer wandering nomadic tribes, we've developed whole systems of ideology and so on. So ideology can be much more important, especially spirituality, as a motivating factor than your tribal group, which is obviously true because we see a lot of people who embrace liberal ideology above their tribal group. We see a lot of religious people embrace their religion above their tribe. Think, for example, of American missionaries going to Africa and evangelizing there, which they see an African Catholic is they're part of their in-group, whereas a white atheist is not. Similarly, for example, with liberals, it's like you see this with the whole Uncle Tom sort of phenomenon, where a black who doesn't embrace the same ideology as them isn't really truly a black. It's not, not truly black. He's not part of the in-group, right? So ideology can very much trump over tribal in-group, and tribal in-group only gets triggered as an instinct, I think, primarily in more aggressive people, and when the group is noticeably under threat. So it's a process that triggers only way down, whereas ideological attacks are triggered much earlier. You see this, for example, in people who are always talking about culture, all the civic nationalists and so on. They are the attack on their culture and their system of ideas is much more obvious. So that's what they focus on, rather than the tribal thing. Whereas, of course, the more confrontational people like myself and many others are more focused on the tribal aspect, and we're less focused on the idea. This might have to do just with the character of people, but I think character of people is, of course, very genetically selected. I do believe in the tripartite, that there are people who have just over generations been selected for warrior, for peasant, for spiritual, caste, for leadership, and so on. I think there's a sort of structure there, which is of course watered down since we don't live in feudal systems anymore, and so on. And with modernity, the travel has become easier, and so on. But I do think that there's this legacy of genetic selection present in us, and so certain people will have a group dynamic that's different from others. Some will have a more militaristic, and therefore more aggressive and confrontational response to things because they come from a line that's more selected towards that, where others will be more passive and accepting because they've been, the more craftsmen and working class and so on. Anyway, to the point of the Crusades, ideologies fight each other because every ideology wants to be dominant, because it wants to be true. Whether it's based on fact or not doesn't really matter. It wants to assert itself as being the truth. Therefore, they fight any other ideology that challenges it. You see this with liberalism today, just as anything else. I mean, they don't fight crusades exactly, but they certainly will constantly in the media attack autocratic and fascistic and whatever regimes like Iran, like Communist China, like Russia. Anyone who doesn't really fall in line, of course. And then internally they do a lot of policing to make sure that like the subjects follow the ideology of the system, which is what the journalists do. The journalists are just, some of them fulfill the same role as evangelizing priests and parochial preachers would have done under a Catholic system. Others fulfill the role of inquisitors. The ones who are more focused and work together with Antifa kind of fulfill the role of inquisitors. And the journalists generally who write for and just put out all these pieces promoting liberalism, they're more like the parochial preachers, really. Everything kind of works similarly. Like the dynamics, whatever the name of the system or the content of the ideology, the methodology and the system kind of always works the same because humans are always, they share general principles. It's kind of part of the perennial view of man, of course. Anyway, so when religions clash, they do so because they want to become a dominant ideology. And so, Islam has jihad, Christendom has crusades. Funnily enough, pagans, of course, never really had religious wars, although I've heard this interesting take that the Viking raiding and conquest were kind of a response to the evangelizing in Germany, where, like, this was Varg's take, I think, where it's like, the idea was, well, Irminsul was burnt and the Saxons were conquered and converted by force to Catholicism in Frisia and so on, and eventually the Norse pagans kind of got organized and as a response started raiding the Christians and so on, and that's why they targeted monasteries and so on. Impossible to prove, but it's an interesting theory, I think, that ideology systems will always defend themselves. That's kind of, I find that kind of interesting, that ideology defends itself more and more rapidly than tribal in-groups. It's a discussion I've been having with friends, and I should maybe do a podcast with friends about this or something, because I'm only presenting one side of the argument, and I'm trying to present the other's perspective, but my perspective is of course much more social Darwinist, and I kind of need a counterpart to discuss this properly. But I'll just put up the song versions after this. I found the Vogelweide interesting. I like figures like this who are both poets and warriors, kind of like if you have Plato's ideal of the philosopher king, then you should also have the ideal of the warrior artist. I like that sort of idea, where you can kill a man in a battle and then, you know, compose a poem in his eulogy and read it at his funeral. That's sort of a noble idea, sort of romantic idea, and I do think Romanticism is very much part of nationalism, because if you don't have romantic inclinations, you can't have spiritual inclinations. Not that you need necessarily be spiritualist to be really nationalist, but to form an ideology, you need Romanticism because you need to form imagery and so on. And if you're a pure materialist, like I sort of am, and which other friends of mine very much are, especially engineers and so on, you can't really form an appealing ideology, because all you're doing is just stating harsh facts. You're saying, oh, evolution is this way, and well, you know, it's kill or be killed, it's will to power, it's might is right, so really it doesn't, none of this matters. All these fancy things you're putting up, like churches and art and all, it doesn't really matter. All that matters is a barrel of a gun. But that doesn't appeal to people, because you sell things on aesthetics as much as you sell it on the strength of ideas and self-interest. Self-interest is very important as well. So yeah, I'm probably just going to do a podcast on this. But anyway, Walther van der Vogelweide, look up the rest of his work. Although most of it is courtly poetry, and courtly poetry is kind of, it's this idea of deifying women and not wanting to touch them. It's this very Christian conception of sex, and it's not really. I don't like it very much, although it's nice poetry, typically. Anyway, that's this rant for now.
Sitt min sündig Augesicht, das reine Land und auch die Erde, dem man so viel Ehren gibt. Mir ist geschehen, dass ich ihr bat, ich bin kommen an die Stadt. Da Gott menschlichen trat. Schön Land, riech und Ehre, was ich dir noch angesäche. So bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschäche? Dass ein Magd ein Kind